When people imagine the age of dinosaurs, they usually think they are imagining the Jurassic. Giant reptiles, endless forests, huge predators moving through the trees, the world still young and wild. But the dinosaur world most people actually picture is not really the Jurassic. It is the late Cretaceous. This is the period of Tyrannosaurus rex. This is the period of Triceratops. This is the period of duck-billed herds, horned dinosaurs, armored tanks, massive titanosaurs, giant flying reptiles, flowering plants, warm seas, and continents that were finally beginning to look familiar. The late Cretaceous was not the beginning of dinosaur dominance. Dinosaurs had already been successful for a very long time before it started, but this was the moment where their world felt the most complete. The ecosystem had grown around them. The land had changed for them. The plants had changed with them. The continents had separated, the coastlines had shifted, and dinosaur life had spread into forms so specialized that it almost feels like the planet had been building toward this final version of them. And that is what makes the late Cretaceous so important. It was not just the last chapter. It was the chapter where dinosaurs became the most recognizable version of themselves. The late Cretaceous began around 100 million years ago, during the final stretch of the Cretaceous period. By then, Earth was already deep into the Mesozoic era. The Triassic had introduced the first dinosaurs. The Jurassic had allowed them to grow into giants and claim the land. But the Cretaceous was different. The world was no longer arranged like one giant prehistoric stage. The old supercontinent was breaking apart. Oceans were opening between land masses. Continents were drifting into new positions. North America was split by a massive inland sea. India was moving as an island. South America, Africa, Antarctica, and Australia were continuing their long separation. The planet was becoming divided, and that division mattered. Because when landmasses split apart, life changes with them. Dinosaurs were no longer evolving inside one connected world. They were becoming regional. Different places started producing different kinds of dinosaurs. North America developed its own brutal and highly recognizable caste. Tyrannosaurs as apex predators, ceratopsians with horns and shields, hadrosaurs moving in huge numbers across floodplains, ankylosaurs built like living weapons. South America had titanosaurs and strange predators of its own. Asia had feathered theropods, horned dinosaurs, and tyrannosaur relatives. The dinosaur world was not one empire anymore. It was a collection of kingdoms. That made the late Cretaceous feel richer than anything before it. The landscape itself was changing too. The Earth was warmer than it is now. Sea levels were high. Shallow seas covered large parts of the continents, creating coastlines, wetlands, river systems, swamps, and floodplains. These were perfect places for life to gather. Plants grew thick. Rivers carried sediment. Animals migrated through open spaces and forest edges. Fossils from this time often come from places like these because floodplains and river systems were excellent at burying bodies quickly enough to preserve them. So when we look back at the late Cretaceous, we are not just seeing a world full of dinosaurs. We are seeing a world that was good at recording them. But the biggest change was not just the land, it was the plants. During the Cretaceous, flowering plants rose quickly and began spreading across the world. This changed the entire texture of life on land. Earlier dinosaur worlds were dominated more by conifers, cycads, ferns, and other ancient plant groups. But flowering plants brought new types of leaves, seeds, fruits, and ecological relationships. Insects changed with them. Herbivores changed around them. Food webs became more complex. This is one reason the late Cretaceous feels so modern compared with the Jurassic. It was still a dinosaur world, but it was no longer completely alien. The forests, floodplains, and plant communities were beginning to move toward the kind of planet we would recognize. Dinosaurs were not walking through a fantasy version of Earth. They were walking through the early shape of our Earth. And they adapted beautifully. Hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs, became some of the most successful large herbivores of the period. They were not just background animals. They were everywhere in many late Cretaceous ecosystems, moving through the landscape in numbers, feeding with complex dental batteries that allowed them to grind plant material efficiently. These animals were not primitive lizards dragging themselves through the mud. They were advanced, specialized, social herbivores built for a changing world. Ceratopsians became another major force. Triceratops is the famous one, but it was part of a larger story. Horned dinosaurs developed huge skulls, frills, beaks, and powerful bodies. They were not simply prey animals waiting to be attacked. A full-grown ceratopsian was a serious problem for any predator. They turned herbivory into something defensive, heavy, and confrontational. The late Cretaceous was full of plant eaters that did not look helpless. They looked like they were built to argue with the food chain. Then there were the ankylosaurs. Low, armored, wide-bodied dinosaurs with heavy plates and, in some species, tail clubs that turned defense into blunt force. They were not fast. They did not need to be. Their bodies were their strategy. In a world of giant predators, some animals survived by running, some survived by hiding, and some survived by becoming nearly impossible to bite safely. And above all of them, in the final stretch of the period, stood the Tyrannosaurs. Tyrannosaurus rex appears very late in the story, near the end of the Cretaceous, but it has become the symbol of the entire age for a reason. It was not just big. It was refined. It was the result of millions of years of predator evolution being pushed into one terrifying animal. Huge skull, bone-crushing bite, powerful senses, massive legs, and a body plan that made it one of the most dominant land predators Earth has ever produced. T-Rex was not the first great dinosaur predator, but it may have been one of the final and most extreme expressions of that role. That is what the late Cretaceous represents. Not dinosaurs beginning to rise, but dinosaurs reaching their most polished forms. By this point, dinosaur life had filled nearly every major large animal role on land. There were giant browsers, herd animals, armored grazers, horned defenders, small feathered hunters, huge predators, nesting colonies, complex growth stages, and ecosystems where dinosaurs were not just present but central. Mammals existed too, but most of them were small. They lived in the margins, in the shadows, underfoot and underground, waiting inside a world that did not belong to them yet. That is why the late Cretaceous matters so much. It shows us dinosaurs not as a failed experiment, but as one of the most successful groups of land animals in Earth's history. They were not dying out because they were outdated. They were not clumsy leftovers from a rougher version of nature. Many of them were thriving, adapting, spreading, specializing. Even if some groups were declining in certain places before the end, the larger picture is still clear. Dinosaurs had ruled land ecosystems for over 150 million years, and in the late Cretaceous, they were still deeply embedded in the machinery of the planet, which makes the ending feel even more brutal, because the late Cretaceous did not end like a slow fade into irrelevance. It ended with a strike. Around 66 million years ago, an asteroid hit Earth near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The impact created the Chicxulub crater and triggered one of the most famous extinction events in history. The immediate destruction would have been unimaginable near the impact zone. Fire, shockwaves, earthquakes, tsunamis, blasted rock, and heat spreading across the atmosphere. But the real killer was not only the impact itself. It was what came after. Dust, soot, and sulfur were thrown into the sky. Sunlight was blocked, temperatures dropped, photosynthesis collapsed, plants suffered. The animals that depended on plants suffered next. Then the predators that depended on those animals followed. The food chain did not just lose pieces. It lost its foundation. That is the horror of the end Cretaceous extinction. A world that had taken millions of years to build was broken in a geological instant. The dinosaurs did not lose because they were weak. They lost because the rules of the planet changed faster than large land animals could survive. A triceratops could defend itself against a predator. An ankylosaur could survive a bite. A T-Rex could dominate almost anything alive in its ecosystem. But none of that mattered when the sky itself turned against them. No armor protects you from a dead food chain. No bite force matters when the plants disappear. No dominance survives if the world that made dominance possible collapses underneath it. Some life did survive. Birds, which are living dinosaurs, carried part of that lineage forward. Crocodilians survived. Turtles survived. Mammals survived. Small size, flexible diets, aquatic habits, burrowing behavior, seeds, insects, and scavenging all became advantages in the broken world after the impact. The animals that inherited the Earth were not necessarily the strongest. They were the ones that could get through the bottleneck. And that is what makes the late Cretaceous so powerful as a chapter in natural history. It is not just the period where dinosaurs ended. It is the period that proves how far they had gone before the end came. If we only talk about the asteroid, we make the dinosaurs sound like victims of one famous disaster. But the late Cretaceous shows they were more than that. They were ecosystem builders. They shaped landscapes by feeding, nesting, migrating, hunting, and dying across continents. They lived through changing plants, shifting seas, rising mountains, and separating worlds. They were not one type of animal. They were an entire age of life. The late Cretaceous is important because it is the final image of that age at full scale. It is the world of herds moving across river plains while flowering plants spread beneath them. It is the world of horned dinosaurs lowering their heads against predators. It is the world of duck-billed animals grinding through vegetation with hundreds of teeth. It is the world of armored bodies moving low through the heat. It is the world of tyrannosaurs arriving late, almost like the final weapon of the dinosaur era. It is Earth before the reset button, and then, suddenly, it is gone. That is the strange sadness of the late Cretaceous. It was not an empty world waiting to be replaced. It was not an old system quietly running out of meaning. It was alive, loud, crowded, and still evolving. The dinosaurs had reached one of their greatest moments right before history cut the lights. And maybe that is why we keep returning to them, not just because they were huge, not just because they were terrifying, but because their story feels impossible. For millions of years, they were the main characters of land life on Earth. They rose, changed, spread, specialized, and became more impressive than almost anything before them. And then the planet turned in one day, and the throne they had held for over 150 million years was empty. The late Cretaceous was the peak of the dinosaur world, and its ending is the reason everything after it belongs to us.